Hi all, I have an absolutely brilliant game to show you today. It's an iconic game played between two iconic players. It was actually awarded a brilliancy prize. So it was awarded the brilliancy prize by the American Chess Bulletin in November 1928, if you want to check that out. Playing white in this game is Aron Nimzovich, one of the leading figures of the so-called hypermodern school of chess. So the hypermoderns were a bit hyper excited. They wanted to find useful exceptions to the established theory of the game, and Nimzovich put a lot of those ideas into My System, a classic book which stands the test of time, has great principles and fundamental philosophies about the game, like prophylaxis in the wider sense. So playing with the black pieces is Frank Marshall. So he's one of the greatest players in the early part of the 20th century, and one of the strongest players in the United States at that time. In fact, he was the US chess champion, from 1909 to 1936. So two really great players. Let's have a look. D4 from Nimzovich. We have knight f6, c4, and maybe Nimzovich was expecting a Nimzovian, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, but Frank Marshall plays b6, so you can call this an accelerated Queen's engine. It still has an idea that potentially e4 can be influenced. So there's an early influence on e4. You don't necessarily need e6 with the pinning down absolutely the knight to control e4. We have knight c3, bishop b7. So here e6 is now too slow. There's no pin. In fact, white can play e4 with an advantage. So this would be, I believe, quite pleasant for white, this position, having an advantage there. And there's a stem game, Boris Gelfand against Jurek in Novi Sad 2016, and Boris actually had a very, very nice win. Let's have a quick flick through that. So with the white pieces, Boris Gelfand got a very, very strong attacking position, as you can see. We're just getting a gist. And he actually went for it over here on the king side, quite brutal coming up. Maybe we should check this game in its own right at some point. So here, quite brutal, yeah. Black resigned here. There's this crushing attack in this position. Okay, let's move on. So anyway, so knight c3, bishop b7 was played, not e6. We have bishop g5. e6 here. Now we have queen c2, and now h6 is played. Bishop b4 has been played before. There's actually a game, Anatoly Karpov against Jan Timman, where Timman actually won from this position with bishop b4. So that's also quite interesting. Let's have a flick through there for those interested. So Timman got a good position with the black pieces against the great Anatoly Karpov, and in fact didn't mind his king being displaced, and later he had good pressure on this side of the board, on the king side. These pawns are quite dangerous, so these stem games, yes, that outside pass pawn quite good, and the fork there, but nope, knight's pinned, queen g2, and now that's winning material. So Karpov resigned there. So yeah, interesting stem games around here. We have h6, though not bishop b4, bishop h4, bishop e7. Now white played e4, so white has got in this e4, and maybe Nimzovich is thinking, well, this shouldn't happen. White shouldn't be able to play e4. This is defeating the point of e4 controlling the Nimzo engine, for example. Nimzovich may be outraged at this point. His pin was designed for this sort of thing, to stop white playing for e4, so he must be delighted or something. So black actually, now Frank Marshall played castling, allowing even e5, and Nimzovich must be thinking, this is a dream. This is a dream position, surely. We have knight d5. It seems e5 might be premature, though. It's very, very tempting. It might be premature. Knight f3, the more conservative knight f3, because black can strike at white centre with c5. If castling queenside, then this position, you know, should be about equal. There's nothing really that crushing about it for white. In fact, it's about equal only. So e5, yeah, it seems to be giving way to some provocation from Frank Marshall, and you get the feeling actually if Frank Marshall, in general, very strong tactical players, sometimes with provocation the opponent has weaknesses. With weaknesses, you know, that often sparks great tactics, loose pieces and things like that, and king safety issues. So this act of provocation, allowing e5, very, very interesting. And we have a very strong tactical move now here being played, but it might not actually be the very strongest. But nevertheless, what would you play with black here for 50 points? Okay, knight d5 was played. It turns out also knight h5 should be enough, even though that seems a bit quirky and knight on the rim is dim. It should be enough for black to be okay with a quick f6 after. Knight e8 probably gives white a small edge. For example, like this, with careful play, white can use that space for a small edge, but it is tricky. Black's getting some. So in the game, yeah, this knight d5, very, very interesting, offering, you know, hitting the bishop here. Now probably white made a slight inaccuracy here. It seems very dumb on the surface to play this and allow black to get that dark square bishop. But it might actually be the strongest move technically. Bishop g3 was played. It might actually be best to play c takes d5. So just allow the bishop to be taken. There's a strong move here for white here, which I think changes the picture on the position. Black's lost the defensive knight, so h7 is a bit more sensitive than usual. What would you play for white in this variation for 20 points? Okay, you can play queen e4 with a quick battery against h7 with bishop d3. And it seems this is quite nice for white. For example, here, you know, knight f4 is going to be a threat for knight takes g6. So if black has to play like this quite energetically, it seems white's getting a big advantage going for the hack attack. Yeah, very, very interesting stuff with just c takes d5. It's not so clear cut as you might think. Here, maybe knight f3, it's just equal. That's not as good. Yeah, it's better to play queen e4. So that queen e4 idea is very, very interesting. So bishop g3 though was played, and here Frank Marshall plays a move which some commentators seem to think is a wonderful move, wonderfully dynamic tactical move, but actually there might be a simple, a fairly simple solution for black that exists in this position to get a concrete advantage. Because if we look at it, the white centre has been slightly overextended. It's prone to undermining operations like c5, which makes it sort of easier to collapse. If you look at the white pieces, they're still at base. In fact, so what would you play here? If I give you 10 seconds to think about this. Okay, in the game, I mean, the celebrated move in the game is knight b4. It turns out here that knight takes c3 is actually rather powerful. It's opening up this bishop, so, you know, it's tying down this bishop. On queen takes, there's d5, and white does seem to be near collapsing. The centre here is near collapsing. For example, knight f3, c5. You can start to feel it's unpleasant. This rook can quickly come to the c file to harass the queen. So for example, like this, very energetic play from black, and it's near disaster, you know, threatening bishop b4, the king's still in the centre. It looks really bad development for white. Black's getting a big advantage there. And in this position, on d takes, instead of d takes, if bishop e2, then this bishop opens up after d takes. And what does white want to do here? There's pressure on d4. This is a really nice, powerful bishop. If castling b5 and black gets that d5 square, black should have an advantage here, a significant one. So that is a very, very interesting choice, not to be underestimated. Knight takes c3. And if b takes c3, again, you know, d5, this position is nice for black as well. So it looks pretty rosy, basically. But anyway, knight b4 was chosen. This is interesting. It's more tactical content here. Queen b3, hitting that queen. Queen b3 now. Perhaps white could be okay with queen d2. That seems to be a precise reply. For example, here, knight f3. Because the threat is actually knight takes d4, queen takes knight c2 check. So holding d4 here. And if d6, e takes this position, the knight could be safely kicked. And they look a little bit awkward, these knights. So white should have a small edge there. But queen b3 was played. So Nimzovich maybe is excited with the prospect of d5. It seems a little bit strange, this decision. We have the move d5 now. E takes. Bishop takes d6. Clearly, if c takes d6, then that drops a whole piece. Queen takes b4. So bishop takes d6. And white castles queenside. So the thing is, castling queenside brings with it some extra responsibilities. These pieces are still a bit tied down. It seems, this diagonal is pretty good. G2 is on the fire here. This diagonal is good. And the king, there are extra weaknesses to try and make sure it don't get exploited. We have knight 8 c6, and there's also tempo gains in the air here, like knight a5. So this doesn't look that pleasant for white generally in terms of king safety and the availability of forcing moves that black has. They're in good supply here. On c5, maybe knight f3, and if bishop takes g3, this position should be about even. Okay, so knight ac6, hc6, yes, interesting move. Bishop takes, queen takes, and now a3 is played, trying to kick the knight. On knight f3, I mean, this is a difficult position here. This queen's subject to harassment with knight a5. But there aren't too many pleasant choices here. It is actually quite nice for black now. Nimzovich is really, he's under fire here. This d4 square is potentially under fire as well in some lines. So a3 was chosen. But if we look at knight f3, for example, okay, that holds d4, but then knight a5, this position, it looks as though black's getting a very, very good, promising position. For example, like this. There's a lot of pressure. It looks really, really awkward. Whatever prospects white had of an attack is just disintegrated. Black's got really nice central control. The possibility of doubling rooks. Black's in the real driving seat. Even if the rooks gets exchanged off, there's a nice little pawn now emerging. Black can win material. So it looks as though things can go really downhill with knight f3. c5, I mean, let's rule some other things out at move 14. c5, queen f4 check, and then knight takes d4 is possible, believe it or not. Because if queen takes b4, guess what black has? Okay, 10 seconds. Black to play and win. Just for those on stream. Okay, knight e2 check unveils an attack against the queen. Look at the whole position, not just the move. And you see that the queen's unveiling an attack there, winning the queen. If we again look at bishop d3, then just knight takes d4. Knight ge2, this runs into knight a5. And then another tempo game, bishop c6. The queen's really embarrassed here. Knight b5 is an example. This position, it just remains really awkward. There's knight a2 check there, rather cheeky. And then a6. This position is just kind of disastrous for white. So I think Nimzovich has... this is a very, very bad position he finds himself in, to have to play a3 here. It's tactically very dangerous. So, but there's a really, really interesting move that's played here. And some commentators have given this, double exclamation mark. I'm not entirely convinced. We can only look at these games over and over again with the latest, analysis technology. And I think analysis itself of such games, they have to evolve from feedback. I think good feedback mechanisms have to be made available. Maybe lots of eyes on every line analysed. But this move was given like a brilliancy description by a lot of annotators. Can you guess what the move played was for 100 points? before we check out some other things as well, just for those interested. So what do you think Frank Marshall played in this position? It is rather magical looking. So 10 seconds. Okay, knight takes d4. You might think, what is this? Because, yes, isn't it just giving up a bit of material here? Before we get into this, it turns out here, you know, Queen f4 check is actually rather strong indeed. If we look at Rook d2, because if King b1, then there's this nasty Queen f5 check. The knight, you know, does have classic square control here. And in fact here, there's a real crusher of a move. Can you see what black plays in this position? They say, you know, when the knight's on the 5th rank, you should kick it back. And there's a good reason here, because there's a disaster. Black to play here. 10 seconds. Okay, knight takes d4 is possible. So if rook takes d4, knight c2 check, and knight takes d4. And if queen takes b4, then there's knight c2 check and taking the queen. So in other words, yeah, this position, I mean, there is no king b1 basically because of this queen f5 check. So let's say rook d2 is forced, but it turns out here rook a d8 is surprisingly strong. Or even rook f d8, either rook hitting d4 basically. d4 is kind of vulnerable. And you might think, again, what is this? The thing is, let's look at d5 first. This position, there's knight d4 here, and check and taking here, black's getting a big advantage. Instead of d5, what other things in this line? If a takes b4, you might think, knight takes d4, and what does white do? If here, then can you see what black does? Which is quite crushing. Okay, 10 seconds for 100 points. I mean, basically, these pieces are just all at home. Here, they're just all at home, and black's pieces are alive and kicking. There's knight b3 check. So if queen takes d2 check, and queen e1 check, winning one of these asleep pieces, the bishop on f1. It's rather brutal, you know, the kingside state of affairs here for Nimzovich. So that was a takes b4, and if knight f3, then there's knight takes d4. So this is crushing. So if queen takes, there's knight takes f3 and looking at d2. And if here, again, looking at d2, it's a disaster. There's things like bishop takes g2 here, very tactical, for knight d3 check. And this is just overwhelming. It's just an overwhelming position tactically for white. White's getting slaughtered. Yeah, just losing material very, very easily. So these lines are all pretty devastating actually after rook a d8. And in fact the other rook works as well, for the record. Rook f d8 works as well, hitting d4. If a takes, we get similar looking themes here, knight b3 check, knight takes d2 check, for example. Or here, after knight takes, if queen a4, yeah, there's still knight b3 check, knight takes d2. So it's all pretty unpleasant. Queen f4 seems actually fairly non-controversial, actually, objectively speaking. It's kind of non-controversial. But knight takes d4 is very, very interesting. And here, I think Nimzovich got a bit freaked out, in fact. He played rook takes d4. One might suspect, why did he rule out queen takes b4 here? Because that's another option. So let's have a look. On queen takes b4, there's c5. So that cements the knight hits the queen. And the queen is actually put in Siberia here after bishop c6. You might wonder why it's put in Siberia on a6. Because once it's there, it's like locked out of the game, yeah? The thing is, if queen c2, then there's queen f4 check. And so if queen d2, there's knight b3 check. And if rook d2, we just take the queen. So if the queen's put in Siberia, is that the end of the story though? Queen f4 check, maybe Nimzovich had this in mind as being absolutely terrible, this kind of position. So the queen's locked out of the game. And this queen's like running rampant, it seems. But I actually just experimentally ran this territory, ran some simulations here in this particular territory. Queen in Siberia, is that the end of the game? Let's look at this check for a moment, and black doubling rooks. It seems white can try and play for bishop d3. There's also an immediate knight takes d4 here. If we look at the immediate knight takes d4 for bishop d3, this is looking very, very peculiar. You might think, what on earth is this? But in fact, white has interesting resources here, like knight c5, very interesting tactical resources. The queen's not totally without influence there. In this endgame, if we take it to the limit now, this endgame where the queen comes out of Siberia, I managed to find a way for black to win this kind of position eventually, and that is to bring the king to king up to exchange the queens on e5. Black can get basically a winning endgame eventually like that with that method. It's very, very tricky, but there are ways to play that position. But yeah, it looks as though this is a tricky position. So that was with knight takes d4. On knight c1, e5 is more clear cut for e4. It looks as though black should be getting a nice advantage with the queen cut out of the game. So the queen's imprisoned there, and this queen is running rampant, it seems. So it seems a little bit more straightforward. But even here, it's not that by that much actually, as you'd think. Until you progress, the pawns are impressive. Black should be absolutely great here though by this in this particular line example. So anyway, to cut a long story short, Nimzovich didn't play queen takes b4. It's a very, very interesting option, but maybe it's not entirely that bleak. It was pretty bleak. So he played actually rook takes d4 here, and we have queen takes d4. And it's a very, very tricky position for white indeed. This kingside development is just a nightmare. It's a total, hasn't been developed at all. Very, very strange, peculiar position with this accelerated bishop development, putting pressure on g2. The d file looks very nice. The king safety looks very nice. There's pieces poking into key squares around the king, whilst black king has nothing around it. So it does look very bad state of affairs. A takes b4 is played. If queen takes b4 here, queen takes f2, and if bishop d3, queen takes g2, and mopping up material. So yeah, very, very interesting. So a takes b4 there, queen takes f2. And if knight f3 here, bishop takes, and then queen takes. And the rook's being lost here. These pieces are just not very stable. Try to come out of the locks. Instead of knight f3, you might think knight ge2. This position again, there's so much pressure on the white position. The rook's coming to the d file. That's great. So yeah, so a takes b4 was played, not queen takes b4. Queen takes f2. We have queen d1 being played, holding the bishop. If knight h3 instead, then there's queen e3 check, and b5 is strong. For example, here a5, and lines are being sliced open. The king is not very good there. For example, like this is just going to be great. In fact, the king finds itself in a mating net here in this line and has to give back material to avoid being mated. So very, very dangerous lines. So queen takes f2, queen d1. We have rook fd8, queen e2, check, king c2. And yeah, line opening now is in progress with a5, trying to open up the lines against the white king. We have b takes a5. If white refuses that and plays b5, then a4, and then a3, this position after bishop takes f3 and rook d2, this is just crushing stuff. Rook takes b2. Yep, that's looking like checkmate. So b takes a5, lines are being opened, rook takes a5. So Frank Marshall's really in his element here. This king hasn't got much defense around it. These pieces still at base. We have knight f3 and now this invasive rook pinning the bishop to h1. It's horrible for white to try and defend this position. King b3 and then more line opening, quite vicious. b5. Queen e5 was played, trying to desperately get the queens off. If c takes b5 here, bishop d5 check, and there's a weakness of the last move there. It's neglecting a4, and here this is just running into all sorts of nasties. The king finds no peace here. Basically, it's just winning tons of material. And instead of c takes b5 there, if knight takes b5, then bishop takes f3, and then c6, and then this b file is pretty vicious. Yeah, this is really just crushing stuff. So, yeah, it seems Nimzovich's king is not very happy about this opening here. B takes c4 check, king b4. And in fact here, Frank Marshall plays queen c1 looking at b2. It's such a strong position that, well, anyway, this is one of the strongest moves. There was also c5 check by this point. That's also dangerous. For example, check. This is going to be winning the queen. That was also strong. But queen c1, it's getting desperate now. How does white defend b2? White tried knight b5. On queen e2, there's bishop takes f3. And here there's check and rook b1. And this is just absolutely crushing. King's being kicked around. So knight b5 and c5 check. The game actually ended here after c5 check. So why? Well, if queen takes c5, that neglects b2. So queen takes b2 check and rook a4 check is horrible. Yeah, and so if after c5 check, queen takes c5. If king takes, then there's just rook d5 check, and rook takes e5. So that's horrible. So yes, let's just run this through again with queen takes c5 again. So this is a horrible continuation, which is the main line. But I'll put you back to the game end position, c5 check. So a devastating win there, actually. It seems Nimzovich, maybe Frank Marshall found a really teasing idea of, one of the whole points of the Nimzo-Indian defense is to clamp down on white playing e4. Maybe Nimzovich should have even written that intuitively in his documentation for the Nimzo-Indian defense. You don't want to allow this e4 and e5. But you always have to, take into account the nuances of the position. It seems in this particular game, this immediate e5, maybe it was overkill, in fact. So black playing this teasing opening caused Nimzovich to castle queenside, where there's a lot more responsibility for weakness management. And Frank Marshall was totally in his element, opening up the lines really aggressively and really confounding knight takes d4. Already he had a massive position. Now, it seems technically queen f4 was crushing pretty non-controversially. But if you look at this, even with currently, technology at the moment, 2020 with Stockfish 11, it seems as though knight takes d4 does ultimately get very strong positions anyway for black by force, whatever white does. So a really fascinating game of provocation. Nimzovich might, behind the scenes might have been trying to maybe driven to overkill in this game, creating those weaknesses, trying to punish black's provocation and not actually playing the Nimzo-Indian defense to lock down e4 properly. So there's a very interesting undertone psychologically to this game, as if pride might have been at stake for some opening theory and ideas around the e4 square and controlling it. Fascinating stuff. Okay, I hope you found it as fascinating as me. If you want to challenge me for a game, by the way, kingscrusher.tv, register there and challenge me for a game. If you want to check out about this accelerated Queen's Indian defense, check out kingscrusher.tv/accelerated QID. So there's a great course there to check out and train on this provocative opening, especially in this game, highly provocative. Okay. Comments, questions, likes, shares, appreciated. Thanks very much.